Hello everyone, my name's Gillian Dow.
And I'm Alison Daniell.
And we're here in the upper reading room at Chawton House. This is where, if you wanted to consult the books here in the collection, librarian Darren would bring you to this room to study them. So it's very fitting that in a week when we've been really focusing on Jane Austen's own reading and on how readers responded to Jane Austen, that we're in a readerly place. So yes, welcome again. Just to remind you of this rather fabulous map of all the participants on the MOOC this week, a real global spread of MOOC participants, and it's a great thing to see that we've got people coming and joining us from all different countries across the world.
I think every single continent is covered.
Absolutely, and lots of different languages as well. So, I mean, this is something that's struck me every time this course has run, is that we've got real experts in Austen on the boards, commenting and contributing, and we've also got people for whom English is not their mother tongue and who are really coming to Austen new and afresh. So what we're trying to do as tutors on this course is facilitate discussion and make sure that really everyone can get involved.
Absolutely. And one of the best things I think about the MOOC, Gillian, is that it's about the learning that people exchange with each other as much as the learning that they're receiving from us. I think that the peer-to-peer conversation that's happening on the board are really informative, really interesting, and really helping people to get the most out of the books and the texts that we're looking at.
Absolutely, which frankly is just as well, because if we were trying to keep up with everything that's going on, we would be spending many more hours in the day than we have to engage with all the conversations. So carry on contributing, carry on discussing. We have a few things that we'd like to talk to you about today. One of them, of course, is in week one of this course, we introduce you to several very interesting and rich databases.
And there's been an awful lot of discussion about the things that people have been finding out on those databases and the variety of different types of texts which people have been encountering.
That's right. So we started by asking you to look up Charlotte Bronte's reading of Jane Austen in the Reading Experience database, which of course is an open university resource that you can access completely independently of this course. You seem to have been enjoying the receptions of Jane Austen that you find on there, and I wanted just to show you something that's in the Chawton House collection that I think will be of relevance and interest to you. It's difficult for us to have close-ups of all of this material, so take my word for it that what I'm showing you here is a manuscript journal from 1807 that is written by someone called Sophie Mackey. Now, she's an exact contemporary of Jane Austen's, living in Southampton while the Austens are living in Southampton. And this is an account of books I have read, both in French and in English. She's a young woman, she needs the accomplishments of the age, and she's recording her reading, I think mainly to turn it from a very passive and dangerous activity into an active one. If you're writing about your reading, it's not such a sensuous pursuit, it's an education.
Yes, you're a pupil rather than a consumer.
Exactly. And I think that's the fascinating thing about the Reading Experience database, is that it gives you a really broad range of readers' responses to Jane Austen. Now, some of you were engaging with the question of working class readers of Austen, and were there many? Do we have much evidence of those readings? And I think there the interesting thing to say is that no, we don't. Now, this could be one of two reasons. I mean, it's to do with literacy, of course, and we're still in an age where literacy is increasing right through the 19th century. But it's also because the Reading Experience database documents things that survived. And of course, just because you don't write about having read a text doesn't mean you didn't read it, in the same way that just because you own a very fine edition of a text doesn't mean you did read it. So I think what we've been trying really to do this week is get you to engage with all of those ways of reading and types of reading, and questions about how do we know what someone read? Is it an easy thing to get to grips with?
I think it's also important to talk about the economics of reading in the 18th century, because a nicely bound edition, and I'm just going to hold up one volume that we have here of Northanger Abbey. This is a first edition of Northanger Abbey. Those would retail for round about 18 shillings, which is quite expensive, whereas one of these little books, which is Tales of Terror or More Ghosts.
In a horrible conservation binding, for
Yes.
which apologies. I mean, it is really just a little
Yes.
pamphlet. This blue thing has been
Which
added
are
later.
much shorter novels. These were retailing for about £6. So obviously those are going to be more accessible to the general public, but they're also much less durable. They're designed almost to be a consumer product and then not quite thrown away afterwards. But they're whereas this is a work of art.
Yes,
the Northanger Abbey.
Absolutely.
That is designed to. That's designed to be read again and again and again and still look pristine.
Absolutely, absolutely. I think it's worth pointing out at this stage that Alison and I are touching very rare material here. It has been carefully placed here by the librarian, and we have sparkling clean hands. It's not considered to be good practice to wear white cotton gloves to deal with this kind of text. Photographic material, yes. Objects, yes. Books, no. You lose dexterity when you're dealing with printed material with gloves on. But your point about ephemera brings us on nicely to the next database that you've been engaging with this week, which is the Cardiff Database of Production and Reception. And in that, you've been looking at reviews of Jane Austen's work. And I thought it might be useful for you to see what these things looked like when they were first printed. You're getting them in digital form, you're getting them online, on screen. The first reader's experience of these reviews was very, very different. So here we have an April 1799 copy of the Gentleman's Magazine. It's actually quite rare to find them in their original bindings like this, because this blue cover would have been discarded. And then you would have had them bound in leather binding and kept them. So they weren't ephemeral in the way that today's newspaper is tomorrow's fish and chip wrapper, although I think not so much anymore. But yes, so anyway, they would then be bound into something that looked like this. And this is the Monthly Review, one of the biggest reviewing journals of the 18th century. It only starts in 1749. So must be remembered that reviewing is a very new profession. It's a very new practice, and the 18th century and early 19th century are really working out how it should be done. So in this section of the course, when reading reviews of Austen's Pride and Prejudice and Sensibility, Sense and Sensibility primarily, a great many of you have remarked on the really lengthy extracts from the novel. I mean, basically these reviewers are telling us the plot. Why are they doing this?
Because they want you to buy it.
Yeah, exactly. So these are very expensive items, and the reviewers see it as their job to inform you about the content of the material so that you know whether or not it's worth the investment. Also, and a few people raised this point, which I think is very astute, if you read the reviews, you don't need to read the novels themselves. And there's certainly evidence in Austen's fiction of her playing with that. I'm thinking notably of the characters John Thorpe and Isabella Thorpe
yes,
in
of
Northanger
course.
Abbey.
Yes, it gives you enough information that you can talk,
talk
authoritatively about the latest thing.
Yes,
but
having not read it.
Having not read it, but you do. Yes, you don't actually need to have engaged with it yourself.
Absolutely. But some of these reviews were extremely lengthy. I posted in a link to Walter Scott's review of Emma in the Quarterly Review, and here it is. Now, we know that Walter Scott was invited to write the review of Emma by Jane Austen's publisher, John Murray II. Jane Austen moved to John Murray II for the publication of Emma, and here's his review, and look how long it is. It goes from page 189 in the Quarterly to page 201. It's a really lengthy and sustained engagement. One of the earliest examples of a famous author, I mean, at that stage, Walter Scott had published Waverley, although he was primarily known for being a poet, and he's engaging with the person who was to become the greatest novelist of the age. So it's a really important and interesting review to have a look at. What else have we been talking about?
What else have we been talking about? Just a final word on reviews is that Jane Austen kept her own reviews
She did.
from her friends and family.
She did.
Including some not very flattering ones.
Exactly.
And I think I need to find the link to those and I need to put that up.
Yes, exactly.
Somewhere.
I think it is actually linked on one section of the
Right.
course, the opinions of Mansfield Park and the opinions of Emma. Well worth a look at.
Definitely.
What Jane Austen is hilarious about, I think, is knowing that that she's the person who knows the kind of novel she wants to write, and she's very determined. I mean, when the Prince Regent's librarian, James Stanier Clark, says to her, "Oh, you should tackle a novel with a clergyman," she replies to him that this would be absolutely impossible for her to do, that she has to go her own way and stick to her own, stick to her own guns,
Stick to her own guns,
yeah,
really, yes.
Yeah. Yeah, so yes, that's an interesting point. So we then wanted to talk about Godmersham Park and Jane Austen's own reading. I think that's an important thing to move on to at this stage. So that's a really great database, and it's been lovely to see all of you engaging with the Reading with Austen database that's been part of the discussions this week. It's been a project here at Chawton House that we've been working with Professor Peter Saber at McGill for many, many years. So it's great that it finally went live last year. And you can look at the shelves of Edward Knight's library at Godmersham Park in Kent, and you can see the kind of thing that Austen had access to. Although, of course, those books were on the shelf. Did she read them all? No, of course she didn't. Did she have access to them? Could she have read some of them? Of course. And in the case of Mary Brunton's Self-Control, as you saw in the video this week of Darren and I discussing her reading, we know she read Self-Control. Now, the great thing about that database is that you can click on the spine and see any interesting features of the books in that collection, including the marginalia. And a few of you have found this wonderful edition of the Baronetage with all the annotations here. You can see heavily annotated around the entry for bridges. With lots of amendments to dates of birth and dates of death, and adding people in and taking people out. And does it remind us of anyone? Well, of course it does. Who does it remind us of?
Oh, well, it's the Elliots,
It
of course.
is. It's
and
Sir Walter, yeah.
The Baronetage, which opens Persuasion.
Yes, exactly. So it's nice to think that Jane Austen might have seen this at Godmersham Park, and it might have inspired her to create Sir Walter Elliot, but we just don't know.
I think on the discussion boards, one of the things that people have been most interested in, Gillian, is the range of books which were available at Godmersham, and the variety of topics that you would expect to find in that sort of country house library. I wonder if you could tell us a little bit more about that.
Yes, well, I mean, it is very typical of a country house library, and I posted a link to Mark Purcell's wonderful recent publication, The Country House Library. He was the National Trust's librarian for many years, and it's a fantastic study. I recommend it highly. The Knight family collection is not dissimilar. It has the kind of range that one would expect. It has a few more novels, and it has a few more novels of Jane Austen's own period, and I like to speculate that Jane Austen, particularly after the death of Elizabeth, her brother's wife, might have had a hand in the purchasing of Godmersham Park, that she might have been guiding her niece's reading in particular, but I cannot prove it.
You cannot prove it. No, she may have been conducting her own market research.
Exactly. Who knows? But yes, several people on the boards have been commenting as well about the extent of the foreign material in the collection, and that's absolutely true. They've got an awful lot of French. Voltaire, Rousseau, but also things like the memoirs of Madame de Maintenon. And I can tell you, because that's still in the collection here, I don't think anyone has opened those volumes, let alone read them. They are pristine. So that's the kind of thing that, you have it on your shelves, because that's the kind of thing you should have on your shelves.
What's the evidence for Jane Austen being able to speak French? And also I've noticed people have been asking about the possibility she may have known Latin.
Yes, absolutely no evidence at all she knew Latin, but I strongly suspect she knew French, and that she was reading works in the original French as well as in translation. She comments on a novel by a writer called Madame de Genlis, a writer I've worked on extensively myself. Her novel Alphonsine, she said, did not do. because independent of a bad translation, it has indelicacies. Now, we're not entirely sure what the indelicacies are, but how would she know it was a bad translation had she not been able to compare it to the original? You know, I think she knows a lot more French than she claims to.
But translation in the 18th century, and I know we're going to talk about this
That's
more.
a week 3 topic.
Week 3 topic, is not necessarily translation as we would understand it today.
No, absolutely. You're expected to adapt, you're expected to change. You'll be seeing a lot more of that in the weeks to come. I mean, another thing that people have been talking about a lot this week, and I think there's an element of frustration is, but I still don't understand much about Jane Austen herself. What do we know about her? And I think, well, we're going to be talking a lot more about that next week, because there's a whole section on biography in week 2. But I think what I always like to do is come back to how do we know what we think we know. And there was a sort of interesting sub-discussion based on, did Austen hate Bath? Did Jane Austen hate Bath? And it's a sort of biographical certainty that she did. Someone on the boards raised the point that, well, they'd watched a BBC documentary in which it was absolutely stated that Jane Austen hated Bath. Certainly her nieces and nephews raised that in the first biography. There is no primary evidence for it. And I think that's the dangerously slippy thing about Austen as a historical figure, is there are very few unmediated accounts of herself.
Yes, although we've got big fat volumes of letters, actually, in terms of what she would have written and journals she could have kept, those letters are minimal, really, and they don't express really deeply held
there's no sense
opinions.
There's no sense of interiority, and I think that's the thing we absolutely want to get to. So anyway, more of that definitely next week in the biography section. I think we've covered most of what we wanted to talk about here, but you did want to bring up the issue of Gothic reading, didn't you, a little bit more?
Yes, we've been talking a little bit about what novels are acceptable.
Yes.
And are novels acceptable at all as reading.
Exactly.
And I think one of the things that we need to remember is that the novel, even in Jane Austen's day, is a very, very, very new literary form. It hasn't really attained the ascendancy that it's going to go on to achieve in the 19th and the 20th centuries. And as such, it's a little kind of frowned upon, and people probably would read novels but then perhaps pretend they didn't, or they would pretend that they read certain authors. Maybe they would read Fielding and then pretend that they didn't read Mrs. Radcliffe and the Gothic novels. And I think that this is something that Jane Austen is really playing with in Northanger Abbey. And there's also a question of gender as well there, Gillian.
Well, there is, I think, and you'll all know the reference in Pride and Prejudice where Mr. Collins is invited to read to the Bennet sisters and notices that the work in question is from a circulating library and claims that he never reads novels. And that's when he picks up Fordyce's sermons to Lydia's distress and dismay. So yes, Jane Austen's well aware that novel reading is seen to be a dangerous occupation. She doesn't take much truck with that
She
theory.
doesn't take much truck with that. I mean, although Catherine does do some fairly foolish things on the back of having read Udolpho.
Well, that's true.
But she uses Henry Tilney, I think, in a very interesting way to mediate on behalf of the novel, because he loves Belinda and Cecilia and Camilla. He has read these books.
Absolutely.
He approves of them.
Absolutely.
And he says they are, the product of the best and most intelligent of minds.
Yes, absolutely.
And it's given extra weight because it is mediated through a male voice. I think that's important.
I think so too, and I think also we'll probably want to remember that Jane Austen says in a letter to Cassandra, 1798, I think, but you would need to check that. She's invited to join a new circulating library, Mrs. Martin's circulating library, and she says, well, very happy to join this circulating library. Mrs. Martin is telling us that it will include a range of material besides the novel, and then she ends by saying she need not have taken this pretension with our family, great novel readers and not ashamed of being so.
Absolutely.
Which is very telling, I think.
Well, I think Jane Austen was one of the subscribers to Fanny Burney's novel Camilla. And if I'm right, I think that may have been the only time she saw her name in print.
There was one other time
One
she
other
subscribed to a book of sermons as well. So yes, that's probably a topic for an article rather than our discussion here today.
She was happy to support a fellow artist and
absolutely.
to have her name in print to advertise the fact she'd done so.
Yes, that's right. So, if you want to hear more about Jane Austen's reading and about some of the topics on this course, we're actually hosting a lifelong learning day at the University of Southampton on the 26th of January. It's a Saturday. I don't expect that the course participant in Hawaii will be joining us, but I hope that some of you more closer to home will be able to make it. Alison will be there too, and we're looking forward to meeting you.
Yes, it would be lovely, and looking forward to next week.
Yes, and you've written some of the material.
Yes,
for next
we're
week.
looking at economics and how women supported themselves or not.
So thank you for joining us, and we will see you on the board soon.
Thank you. Bye-bye.